Good evening, everyone. My name is Bona Sherman. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I'm honored to be part of this conversation, which I believe is very important, and to be sharing my stories with you all. I was born and raised in Korea. I grew up there until my family immigrated to the US when I was 12. And today, the part of the conversation that I wanted to have with you all is on microaggressions. If you were to ask me maybe a few years ago what my view on racism was, I may have just shrugged and say, hey, I haven't really experienced racism. But within the last few years, I realized the level of racism that I had experienced was almost as equivalent as 1,000 paper cuts. Instead of experiencing big stabs of racism in my life, I've realized that slowly but consistently, I've experienced paper cuts of racism. And ironically, many of those paper cuts were caused by me, for me to justify other people's behavior and actions. Immigrating from a monoethnic and monocultural society to a multicultural country was very difficult because on a daily basis, you suddenly recognize that you are one of the different ones, especially because you grew up with so many people that look like you. All of a sudden, by just being in the country, looking different, you realize you become so sensitive and uncomfortable with what's happening around you. And that's how my little paper cut started. Have you ever been to a room just full of a specific race of people and you're the only one, if not one of the very few races, very few race that are different from the room? It just makes you feel so aware of who you are, and just that it makes you feel like everyone is looking at you or everyone is questioning your existence, even if they're not doing that. It's just a level of awareness. And without understanding how to process that, I think that's how my paper cut started. Then at some point of my life, I realized I was viewed as a Korean girl, not as Bona. So any actions that I take was viewed as what the Korean girl did, not what Bona did. So if I was loud, they would say, oh, Korean girls, they're so loud. If I'm hyper, they would say, oh, Korean girls, they're so hyper. If I do well on my test, it's not because Bona studied hard. It's because, oh, Koreans are smart. They could do that. And that is sort of the stereotype. I think Joe talked about it, the model minority complex sort of always kind of reside in me, right? So I felt so burdened. I felt like I was never able to make a mistake because, or else it would be the Koreans that I'll be shaming. So with that, I started to build more paper cuts. Then there were these expectations. Because you're Korean, because you're Asian, you must do this, you must do that. You must be good at math because you're Korean. You must be able to know how to play piano. You must obey your teachers because that's part of your culture. You must know how to cook because you're a Korean girl. You must, you must, you must. And I was not expected to become who I was or what I enjoyed. And at a certain point, I even forgot who I was or what I enjoyed because I was so busy living that stereotyped life that people expected me to live. Comes with more paper cuts. How about expectations from my own? It was my culture. It was my parents who silenced us. They would say, hey, racism doesn't exist if you're successful. So study hard and become successful. Or they say things like, discrimination only happens to those who alienate themselves, who separate themselves from the majority of the society. We never talked about racism. And we always, whenever something remotely racist happens, they would justify it. Oh, that person is crazy. It's not racism. It's just that person. That person doesn't know how to deal with that. So I was never able to, I was never taught to process what racism is. And this idea, the idea that we were consistently told that we live in their country, we are outsiders living in their country. Therefore, we do not talk about this. We are grateful for the opportunity that we're given. And this idea prevented me for a very long time to feel like I belong here. and that this was my country too. Comes with more paper cuts. Slowly and consistently, I was feeling those paper cuts. How about those jokes? After I dinged my car at no fault of my own, I would hear, oh, that's okay. You're Korean. You're an Asian driver. We know you don't know how to drive. Ha ha ha, just kidding. How about the food? I would not eat Korean food if I knew that I had to go somewhere because I was afraid of smelling like some Korean food. I had to change my action, my diet, my clothes, my hair, so many things for other people so that I wouldn't be different. More paper cuts. Then the deepest paper cuts came very recently. And this time it came with fear. Fear for my parents, fear for the future of our children, fear for our Asia children, and fear for myself. I was afraid for my parents to go grocery shopping. And I would respond to when my daughter and I would go to the playground and play. My daughter would speak to me in Korean, but I would respond to her in English because I was afraid that people would look at us as outsiders. My heart broke so incredibly as these vulnerable elderlies, they were getting punched, they were getting kicked without anyone helping them. And I was so enraged to see the students being spat on by their own classmates. And along came, with the series of events, came Racism Olympics. Have you heard that term before? People talked about who has it worse. What race is more oppressed? How could you talk about racism against Asian people when there's racism against other races that are more serious going on with more historical backgrounds? It never had to be a race. It never had to be a racism Olympics. There needed to be support, there needed to be acceptance, and there needed to be space for all of us to be able to express our emotions. So I really thought about this. What can we do? What must we do? How can we better this situation? And I think Steve talked about it a little bit. Remember how when we were growing up, they said, oh, children, they're colorblind. We should not teach our children about colors or races. Did you know that this is just an easy way for us to avoid having a conversation on race and racism? Kids, they see things and they feel things. They see the differences that exist in the world. So we need to talk about race and the tags that come along with it. We need to give our children tools on how to continue this type of conversation. We need to destigmatize the different races, and we need to start celebrating our differences, and we need to celebrate other people's races as well by educating them, by empowering them. We need to teach them about Asian history. We need to teach them about Asian American history in order for them to realize and identify themselves. We need not to raise our children to become colorblind, or we don't need to shush them when they ask questions about differences and different races, but rather we need to raise our children to openly celebrate differences and embrace them. Thank you so much for this opportunity, guys.